Coming up on Jerusalem Dateline, the UN demands a ceasefire without linking it to the return of the hostages. South Lebanon farmers protest their land being used for launching missiles. And in northern Israel, 80,000 people on the run from their homes. Plus, the plan to put a seaport next to Gaza. Could this be a Trojan horse? And Jerusalem's Purim Parade, the first one in 42 years. All this and more coming up on this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell. The U.S. voted to abstain Monday on a United Nations Security Council resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. Many see this as another major break between Israel and the U.S. over the war to defeat Hamas.
The draft resolution has been adopted.
The non-binding resolution passed unanimously with the U.S. abstaining. It was the first UN Security Council ceasefire demand to pass since the beginning of the war. The resolution read in part, an immediate ceasefire for the month of Ramadan, respected by all parties, leading to a lasting, sustainable ceasefire. Separately, it also called for an immediate and unconditional release of all the hostages. The resolution did not condemn Hamas or mention the atrocities of October 7th. Despite the abstention, the White House said it reflected no change in its policy.
It's very consistent with everything that we've been saying we want to get done here. And we get to decide what our policy is. The Prime Minister's office seems to be indicating through public statements that we somehow changed here. We haven't.
But after the vote, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu canceled the visit by his national security officials to discuss Israel's planned incursion into Rafah. He wrote the U.S. backed down from its stance of linking a ceasefire to the return of the hostages. He added, it gives Hamas hope that international pressure will allow them to get a ceasefire without releasing our hostages. In a statement after the vote, Hamas praised the resolution. Others, like former U.S. Ambassador to Israel David Friedman, wrote on X, just a naked demand for Israel to hand Hamas an ill-deserved victory. Hamas is celebrating the result. That tells you all you need to know. Former President Donald Trump told an Israeli newspaper that Israel has to finish its war on Hamas. We've got to get to peace. You can't have this going on. And I will say Israel has to be very careful. Because you are losing a lot of the world, you are losing a lot of support. Representative Mike Waltz sharply criticized the move.
It's shameful. We don't go neutral when it comes to Israel. It's ridiculous. And if I were Netanyahu, I would pull back his delegation.
Democrat Senator John Fetterman wrote, it's appalling the United States allowed passage of a resolution that fails to condemn Hamas. Republican Senator Ted Cruz wrote, today's resolution is a capitulation to and victory for Hamas. But Senator Bernie Sanders praised the resolution and wrote, the U.S. must push all parties to honor the ceasefire and rush massive humanitarian aid into Gaza to feed starving people. Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, already in Washington, warned of consequences if Israel does not defeat Hamas.
We have no moral right to stop the war in Gaza until we return all the hostages home. If we do not reach a clear and decisive decision in Gaza, it may bring us closer to war in the north.
Well, joining me more to talk about this UN resolution is our CBN News Middle East analyst, John Wagi. In our studio, John, this seems to be a series of things going on between Israel and the U.S., really straining this relationship like never before.
Yeah, Chris, it hasn't even been 6 months, and it seems like more than that this atrocity committed by Hamas led to the war that ensued. And you look back on that time, remember in November, it was just November of last year when President Biden came and they had the big bear hug at the airport with Prime Minister Netanyahu. And with a small break for the holidays, Thanksgiving, Christmas, Hanukkah, there was a time of relative peace and calm. But ever since 2024 emerged with the CIA report that all of a sudden leaked to the New York Times and whomever else saying, you know what? it looks to us like Benjamin Netanyahu's political base is weakening, and it's just not good for Israel.
Which didn't seem to be true.
Right.
Yeah.
But the point was that it got out there, and it also coincided with the political situation in the United States, where there were massive protests against the Biden administration for continuing to support Israel. And ever since that time, we've had really bookmark after bookmark of events that have soured the relationship between U.S. and Israel. And one of the most really poignant ones to me came when Chuck Schumer, is Jewish and has always been a supporter of Israel, basically turned on Netanyahu and turned on the current Israeli government. And I thought at the time that I sensed that might be like a political Chernobyl, that we would see a meltdown. And it looks like that's what's happening now, culminating in this last UN vote, where it's clear that the breach is really serious between the Biden administration and Israel. I don't say the United States and Israel because public support is still strong for Israel, basically speaking, in the United States.
Yeah. Talk about the resolution a little bit, because it did call for an immediate ceasefire during Ramadan, and it also called for the unconditional release of the hostages, but it didn't link the two.
It didn't link the two, and that was Prime Minister Netanyahu's major complaint. The reason he decided not to send the delegation to Washington was that if you're not going to condition the release of the hostages, and by the way, not mention the atrocities committed by Hamas, well, there's no reason for us to go to Washington, because we can't accomplish anything. And Netanyahu has said and pledged over and over to his soldiers that they will continue to the victory, military victory over Hamas, because anything other than that represents an existential threat.
Yeah.
So,
and if anything, it seems to strengthen Netanyahu politically, because the country seems behind him. The soldiers are behind him. They want to make sure that they go to total victory.
Right, and there is a certain amount of upset over the Netanyahu's standing with the public, but it's still he's still strong enough because the country doesn't want the division.
Talk about the impact on the U.S. What does this mean for the U.S.? And we've talked about this before, the U.S. and the U.K., nations that are turning against Israel.
Right. And I wouldn't limit it to those two nations. I think that every nation on earth is going to see more of a shaking as a result of this split that's happening between the United States' greatest ally in the Middle East and Israel. I think back to a story you did, Chris, just a very short time ago, when you were up in the north at Kiryat Shimona, and Colonel Marco Moreno said, and I wrote it down, there's going to be war in the north.
Right.
And I think the implications are that these powers, these enemy powers of Israel, are going to be emboldened to take steps that we don't even know what they might take. Russia, China, North Korea, Syria, the Hezbollah in Lebanon, and of course the other Iranian proxies, not to mention Iran itself.
Yeah.
So.
Well, it's true. It could be global implications, and also, valleys, many nations in the valley of decision right now.
Good time to pray.
Exactly. Thanks, John. Up next, farmers in South Lebanon putting their foot down about Hezbollah on their land. Hezbollah is well known for using Lebanese civilians as human shields. Evidence shows that terrorists hide weapons in densely populated areas to lure Israel to strike. In this exclusive report, George Thomas shows us how the group uses Christian farms in the south to target Israel.
3 kilometers from here, you can see my village there. You can see my olive orchards, my pine trees, and my pecan trees. They get shelled every day since the beginning of war.
Joseph, a Christian farmer here, and 12 of his workers recently came very close to losing their lives.
I saw death in my eyes.
We're concealing his identity because he lives among Hezbollah supporters. The farm sits near the South Lebanon border, close to the Israeli town of Metula. Since the Hamas October 7th attack, his village and adjacent farm have come under constant Israeli shelling. March 13th, they were on the farm when Israel struck.
2 minutes after reaching the farm, they hit us with a 120mm mortar. I got hit by a shrapnel on my arm, and when the second mortar was coming, I told the guys to hit the ground and stay flat. It landed 30 meters away from us.
Here is why Israel often targets his and other nearby farms. CBN News has obtained exclusive pictures and videos showing how Hezbollah today here in the southern part of Lebanon is using farms owned by Christians in order to launch their missile attacks against Israel. Joseph took these images a few days after that strike, showing multiple Hezbollah missile systems in the middle of his olive grove.
They keep using our land as a launching pad. They assemble their missiles here, then fire them into Israel.
He's been losing money since daily border fights erupted 5 months ago.
We don't want our land to be a staging ground for war between these two parties. We take no part in this. What's happening in Gaza is not our war.
Joseph says he's repeatedly asked the Lebanese army to intervene, hoping to stop Hezbollah fighters from using his farm, but to no avail. South Lebanon is under Hezbollah control, and Joseph says Lebanese authorities have little sway over the terrorist group.
We have become accustomed to these strikes happening to us because we live close to the Israeli borders. Sadly, we have no say in peace or war. We Christians always pay the price.
Since war began in Gaza, Hezbollah has fired more than 3,000 rockets at Israeli civilian and military targets, forcing the evacuation of more than 150,000 civilians on both sides of the Israel-Lebanon border.
The more the war goes on, the more I lose money.
Israel and the Lebanese government came to an agreement recently that would allow Christian farmers to work on their properties during certain times of the week. Joseph says he's not taking any chances.
After cheating death once, I don't dare to go to my farm again.
George Thomas, CBN News, South Lebanon.
Coming up, mounting attacks from Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. What will it take to stop them? With Israel's war with Hamas in its 6th month, fighting Hezbollah in the north continues to develop. CBN News Middle East correspondent Julie Stahl takes us to one border town to see how untenable life has become for the few who remain.
This is Metula, Israel's northernmost town, sitting about 50 feet from the Lebanese border. Since October 7th, Hezbollah has rained down more than 150 rockets and anti-tank missiles at the 620 homes here. CBN News joined other journalists on a brisk tour as town council head David Azulai urged us to keep moving due to potential danger.
I'm standing in a house in Metula that was hit by Hezbollah fire. 130 homes in this tiny border community have been hit by Hezbollah fire. Metula is actually older than the state of Israel, and now there's no residents allowed to stay here.
We can't enter our houses. I am the head of the council. I live on the eastern side. For 3 weeks, I didn't go into my house except to take clothes. I'm not sleeping at home.
Almost all the town's 1,600 residents evacuated within the first 2 weeks of the war. Only 30 security personnel remain, staying in a protected area. Houses empty, ripe fruit hangs on garden trees. Fortunately, no one has been killed here, although 1 civilian and 2 soldiers have been wounded.
The car behind me was hit by Hezbollah fire. The driver was getting out at the time. He was wounded, but he managed to survive.
Azulai says peace is the only answer, and there's only one way to it.
The moment the Americans and Iranians finish the story and there is no more threat, there also won't be Hezbollah, because the one who activates Hezbollah is Iran. Everything starts with Iran and spreads out. By the way, Iran is also against the Americans and the Israelis.
Former IDF intelligence officer Sarit Zahavi feels like war began in the north on October 8th.
It's a little bit different from the south because here the communities are even closer to the fence, and there are many of these like that. That's 43 communities that became ghost towns.
Zahavi says since the 2006 war with Lebanon, the north has been relatively quiet, with only dozens of attacks. As a mother and resident here, her fear is what life will look like going forward.
Now we have daily. The average of attacks coming by Hezbollah itself claiming responsibility is an average of about 50 attacks every week in the past few months. And remember, they are not supposed to be there at all by UN Security Council resolution. That's why we saw the preparations for an invasion. We saw how they were deployed on the border.
10 years ago, Hezbollah publicized a plan on its television station for thousands of fighters to invade and take over the Galilee.
The idea is to enter into communities from various areas along the borderline, while each force that will enter will have a mission. And the mission is a civilian community. Nahariya, Shlomi, to trap civilians to become human shields, to take over the main roads, to block the main roads, to prevent any assistance from coming. All the principles that we saw that Hamas executed in October 7 exist in a Hezbollah invasion plan from a decade ago.
Zahavi believes Hezbollah now prefers to drag Israel into a war rather than invade. She adds, given its entrenchment, forcing Hezbollah to withdraw from southern Lebanon, as Israel is demanding, won't truly provide this region the security it needs.
Everybody's talking about withdrawal of Hezbollah, right? What is Hezbollah? It's a terrorist organization, it's a social movement, and it's a political party in Lebanon, member in the Lebanese government and the Lebanese parliament. And that's why I think that the wording, if we talk about a diplomatic arrangement, should refer to disarm rather than withdraw.
Zahavi maintains it's clear that Hezbollah's loyalty is not to Lebanon or its people. They follow Iran, its ideologies and its interests, because the regime has a plan to unite all fronts: Hezbollah, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and other proxies.
This is a painting that was done on the Lebanese side. You can understand the idea. On their way to Jerusalem. That's the mission, that's the idea.
Julie Stahl, CBN News, Northern Israel.
Up next, who's implementing the construction of a seaport alongside Gaza? One expert calls it a Trojan horse. At this year's State of the Union speech, President Joe Biden proposed establishing a pier or port in the water next to Gaza for bringing in humanitarian aid. That raised the question, who would manage it? We asked Middle East analyst Yigal Karman for his thoughts about it all. Yigal Karman, founder of Memory Middle East Media Research Institute, seen around the world. You've written an article recently called A Small Step for President Biden, a Large Step for Total War. And you're kind of focusing on the fact that there was this port coming into Gaza to bring humanitarian aid, but it was given to Qatar. Why is this so important?
Okay. When I heard about the initiative of the port, I was happy, and I wrote an article called Port of Hope, which can mark the reversal from Hamas to UAE, the PA, Jordan, the Emirates, all the peace seekers. And I said it's no less than a miracle that the administration will go for such an act to implement their seeming vision of peaceful agreement. But in no time, I turned to be proven them wrong. The administration granted this port to Qatar, which is granting it to Hamas. Simply, Qatar is Hamas, Hamas is Qatar. Giving it to Qatar means giving it to Hamas. They did a conference call, and who is the minister of Qatar that is dealing with this sport? The one that is in charge of relations with Iran. So Mohammed al-Khulaifi. So there is who we get to deal with the port. Now, the port will become another stronghold for Hamas, and they will control the population. Now, what would be the result? The administration wanted to have an achievement for November, something to ease the pressure on the population, etc. But the Palestinians and Arabs and Hamas, all of them, all the anti-Americans will not perceive it as an act of care, as an act of human values of America, which it has. No, they'll perceive it as weakness. And what will happen as a result? That America cannot stand by its ally, and by all its allies, including UAE, Saudi Arabia, none of them. So the consequences will be that in the north there will be an escalation, in the Red Sea an escalation, in Syria and Iraq the militias will run into larger battles, and even more, Russia and China, they are looking at that. They will say, this guy, President Biden, cannot stand by his allies. He is weak. He's not going to go to war come November. So this is our time. Let's go. And so the Russians will escalate in Ukraine. The Chinese will escalate in the South China Sea and the Philippines and Taiwan. And come November, President Biden will have the opposite of what he hoped for. An act that he thought of weakness and surrender. He surrendered the Palestinians to Hamas. An act that he hoped will help him will turn totally against him, against all, it will be all anti-American forces against America in the region and anywhere else. It's a tragedy.
It is a tragedy. And so you think a lot of this is motivated by presidential politics, by the election, and yet the reverberation here in the Middle East and around the world.
And it will get the opposite result, exactly the opposite result of what he hoped to reach through weakness and surrendering his allies.
Well, Yigal Korman, thanks for your analysis, your insight. It's invaluable during these days when Israel's facing so many threats. And thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
When the city of Jerusalem proposed having a festive Purim parade, the first in 42 years, some of the hostage families protested that the event disrespected their sorrow. City Mayor Moshe Leon offered a compromise. They could march in front and the focus would be on their family members still in Gaza. This year's reading of the Megillah, the story of Esther, held special meaning for sore hearts longing for the return of their loved ones.
What do you think about the parade here today?
I'm here to support the Am Israel must be happy, must celebrate the holidays with the pain of the hostages.
171 days that we didn't see daylight. 171 days that I don't know when he ate something. We are here until they will come back, and remember that there are people that cannot be happy now.
We don't have any other option, and we have to bring them back home as soon as possible.
And I say to the world, if you will not help us solve this issue, it's like you didn't help yourself, because it happened to us that Hamas is intending to make the same thing in every place in the world.
We didn't know nothing about him, and nobody saw him, and no, from the hostages who come back, nobody saw him.
They are deep in our heart, and we won't give up.
My son's first Purim, and so it's kind of really special that it's the first parade in 42 years.
At the war, we should celebrate. We should keep hanging out with our child. Don't let them surround us.
Do you think that the story of Purim relates to the situation we're in today?
I think everyone that read the Megillah yesterday or today, you can feel it.
where enemies tried to bring us down and to destroy the Jewish people, I think that it's really critical that we take this opportunity to celebrate.
I hope the victory of Esther Malka will be now, the victory of Am Israel.
The end of the story, the end of the Megillah, it's what makes you hope. 2,000 years, they are attacking us and they're targeting us, but at the end we survive and God help us, and that's the secret of our nation.
Well, such a mixture of sorrow and celebration. Well, that's all for this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. Thanks for joining us. Remember, you can follow us on social media and access CBN content through our CBN News and other CBN apps. And please continue to pray for Israel, the IDF soldiers, and for the release of all the hostages in Gaza. I'm Chris Mitchell. We'll see you next time on Jerusalem Dateline.